Hi, I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa. And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is lucky episode number 13 in season 3. And we finished our discussion of cults last week, but we thought we'd bring you a special bonus episode this time around. This is the No Fear Podcast. We know what scares you. So, when we were doing the research for our cult episode, we realized very quickly that there was more out there on the topic of cults than we could ever cover in a 3 episode arc. And in fact, there were a lot of movies and books and TV shows that we're fans of that we did not get to discuss. And so we had to kind of put those on the back burner, and we're hoping that we can loop around and talk about those at another time and talk about some of our favorites more in depth. But one thing that I wasn't anticipating is we came up with several movies and stories that we weren't really sure if they fit the definition of cult. And we spent a couple of episodes back really defining what it means to be a cult, and we tried to come up with some sort of definition for it. And still, I'm just not really sure. So we thought we'd kind of talk today about whether some of these things are actual cult movies or cult stories. And I don't know. We'll see where we go with that. I don't know. What do you guys think, Matt and Mel? Are you ready to play a game of Is It a Cult?
Oh, I'm always ready for this game. But
I play it
although
on a daily basis.
I did want to say, because I can't remember if it was a main episode or one of our mini episodes that we do for the Patreon supporters, but I remember we decided on the term cult and cult adjacent. And so I really just want to keep using the phrase cult adjacent because I think that's it's a great descriptor for things that are not quite cults, may not fit the definition per se, but are real close to it. So, yeah, let's play this game.
Yeah. Well, and even like cult adjacent too, because I'm glad you brought that up. Some of these, I feel like I'm not even comfortable calling them cult adjacent. Because I guess in my mind they've never been that, but I don't know. Maybe I can change my mind on some of these, so we'll see. All right, so first one up, Mel, you had brought up Shirley Jackson's short story, The Lottery.
Yes, I did. And I think listeners, if you're interested in Shirley Jackson, you can go back to our first season when we had an interview with Ruth Franklin, the author of the latest biography on Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life. And if I remember correctly, in that interview, we talked a little bit about the lottery. But the lottery is kind of Shirley Jackson's most infamous work, I guess, if you want to put it that way. When it first came out in 1948, it caused a lot of consternation. A lot of people read the story in the New Yorker and they were extremely confused by it or angered by it. A lot of people canceled their subscriptions because they thought it was so horrifying and weird and baffling. And so Ruth Franklin has a great article in the New Yorker about the letters that Shirley Jackson got about the lottery, wondering where they could witness one and being confused in the meaning in other ones. And I have to say, like, while we were doing the cult episodes, I was chatting with you, Lisa, at one point, and I said something like, "Doesn't the lottery seem kind of cultish?" I think that was a word I used, but I do like this cult adjacent term. I don't know that the lottery ticks all the cult boxes because you don't necessarily have one personality running the lottery. But for people who weren't scarred by the lottery in school, the basic gist is that you have a town in New England that seems completely normal. And it turns out that they have a lottery, and you're like, yay, it's a lottery. But the lottery is not what you think. Everybody gets slips of paper. A family is chosen because they get a black dot, and then the family has to draw, and the person who then gets the black mark at that point is stoned to death by everybody else. But the kind of cultish aspects of the lottery, as I saw it, was like this idea of a small group of people kind of bound together or brainwashed by a tradition into doing something that seems completely bizarre and disturbing, but they just do it because everybody has been doing it forever. And the older people in the town claim that they've been doing it forever and it helps with the harvest or however it is they argue about it. And people should not stop it, to the point where when a younger couple asks about it, the older man is basically like, anybody who would stop the lottery is a fool. Like you have to do this. So there's this idea of like the ritual and almost like the just following orders from someone else or people in charge. And the whole community kind of bonds around this ritual stonings. Like I said, I don't know if it's like a cult that goes around a personality or is organized around religion or, wearing icons and things like that. But there seems to be this weird kind of groupthink that I think we talked about with Wild Wild Country, and also kind of a Hotel California-esque aspect, because nobody seems to be leaving this town to go to the towns that aren't doing it anymore. They seem to just kind of follow along. So I don't know, that's some of the stuff that I was thinking about with like the cult-like aspects. What do you guys think about the lottery?
I don't know. I am reluctant to call it a cult. And I don't know why. I just am. But I think one of the things that it does really well is teach us or demonstrate to us the inherent dangers in something like a cult. And that is, Mel, you mentioned the word groupthink, but the idea of doing something without fully understanding why you are doing it. Because that is one of the things that really is so terrifying about this short story, is that everybody gets together to do this really horrific thing. And when you think about it, it's such a small, isolated town that, you're essentially once a year killing off somebody that you have grown up with, that as well as, your own family. Sometimes I guess it would be your own family. And the thing that makes it even that much worse is that, like you said, they do it without thinking. They just see the date on the calendar and like, oh, it's time to do this again. And that's what's so disturbing to me. And I think that's what people find so disturbing about just any type of cults in general. And that's why we're drawn to them and why we're fascinated by them. Because, we talked about this in our main episodes, but, just the idea of how does somebody get drawn into that and not be able to step back and say, this isn't right. This isn't the way things are supposed to be. And that's certainly what you get here. So if it's not a cult, then it's definitely cultish thinking. Maybe that's where I'll land with this story. Is it's cult adjacent in its cultish thinking.
I feel like if you were to do the Venn diagram of of cults and just groupthink, you'd kind of have in the center overlap that mob mentality idea. And I think that's kind of where, because I agree with both of you that it's probably not a cult per se. It definitely doesn't fall under the charismatic leader criteria. But like both of you said, there's the groupthink or the mob mentality or whatever adjective you want to use for it that I think definitely overlaps into cults. I think that's what the leaders of cults use to manipulate people and to get them more mentally pliable so that they're more accepting, is by creating those groupthink situations of conformity, and everybody does this. But yeah, just based on the story and the actions, I mean, maybe it started out as a cult and it's evolved, and it's been so long that the cult leader is long since dead. But I mean, we don't really have that kind of a backstory for it. I mean, I'm just making up a headcanon, really. So
Well, I mean, the old man does say it started as, he doesn't call it like a pagan ritual, but it started as this like, if you do the lottery in June, the corn will be full, or what was it? You do the lottery a certain time, the corn will be, the harvest will be great. And it's like, it is this idea of like maybe it's some sort of old ritual that they followed, maybe almost like, I guess, a cult, but that it's in the modern world, the killing has remained, but not necessarily those reasons for like, our crops are doing poorly, let's kill someone in the lottery and everything will be fine. They've kind of lost the part, but they didn't lose the killing part.
So superstition and mob mentality.
Yeah, yeah. And brainwashing the kids, because one of the most disturbing things about the story is that the kids are the ones getting the rocks, and the kids are at the front throwing the rocks at the people too. So they're getting indoctrinated into this disturbing weirdness at a very young age.
Yeah, that to me is one of the most disturbing parts of the whole story is the moment that that the little boy is given the stone and kind of like, hey, you have to participate. Because you realize where the adults started, you know,
Right.
where they got this idea, and you realize it has been ingrained in them since they were, well, since before they could walk, really. Um,
And they're stoning that little boy's mom too.
yeah, yeah. Mrs. Hutchison, yeah,
Mhm.
they give her littlest boy a stone and kind of like, hey, you can't get past this. You have to be part of it too. So yeah, yeah, that's a disturbing story.
It is a very
Really.
disturbing story.
I mean, I understand why. I understand why people would get angry at that reading it, um, especially if they weren't sure that it was fiction. um, it's problematic.
And I think it also sometimes hits too close to home because we may not stone people, but there's this behavior continues just in different kind of insidious ways.
Right. I mean that's my one one thing with this story is that I mean she's really heavy. Jackson is really heavy-handed on the symbolism in this story, and so yeah, it's easy to see that she's pointing out the problems that we have in society and the things that we hang on to that are damaging to other people that we do without question, and that we don't question it until it's turned upon us. Because that's one of the things I really like about the story is that nobody really. I mean, people question why maybe they're doing the lottery, and there's kind of rumblings that other towns have given it up, but really nobody says we should stop this.
Mm.
Um, not in those many words, and it's not until Mrs. Hutchison realizes that she's the one to die that day that she starts screaming, "It's not fair." Um, or when her family's chosen, I guess. She starts, saying, "You didn't give us time to pick. It's not fair," and that's pretty um, telling, I think, of what Jackson had in mind when she was writing this story, because that tends to be the way we treat problems in our society is we can walk right past them, turn a blind eye if we're not the ones being targeted. So, yeah. I mean, it's a great story. It's a disturbing story, but it should be, I think. Well, okay, here's my problem. And this is why I don't want to say the lottery is a cult. And I'm going to call it cult adjacent. Because I think Jackson was pointing out some of the problems in society, in mainstream society at that. But here's my problem is when you start talking about a cult, I mean, can you just point out, like, to me, this is just an isolated community that has strange customs to us. And I don't know if we can really call that a cult. Like, that doesn't fit what we were discussing as a cult. And I draw similarities to the 1973 movie The Wicker Man because, confession, I love this movie. We will not talk about the remake. And it's very similar. There's a lot of similarities between that isolated community in The Wicker Man and the one Shirley Jackson presents in The Lottery. And so when I started researching cults, I came across a lot of people who were like, "Oh, my favorite cult movie is The Wicker Man," and my first response was, "That's not a cult movie." So I don't know. I've always like classified it under folk horror or something like that, and I'm really, really curious to hear what you guys have to say.
Okay, I think it's a cult.
We'll just come out with it then.
Done. There we go. Problem solved. Case closed.
Moving on.
Check, we're done. I mean, I could see both arguments, but I mean, my thing with them is that they're not just isolated, but there's also this like conspiracy to like they're all working together. Again, that kind of groupthink idea. There's a religious aspect to it, even though it's paganism, and it's a cult of personality because it's always been run by the Lord Summer Isle person, whether it's the grandfather of Christopher Lee's character or the father or him. And so I feel like there's more to that.
Let's be honest. If you're gonna have a cult leader, who would not follow Christopher Lee?
He's pretty charismatic.
Well, if you're not following him for the charisma, you're definitely following him because you're terrified. So
that too.
Well, and this does. I mean, see, I think that's my problem. Is I kept thinking, well, it's just an isolated community that has held on to some sort of pagan beliefs, and does that necessarily make it a cult, or does it make it not Christian? And that's where I have trouble. But then you're right, Mel. Like, I wasn't thinking about the conspiracy, and they do. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. There's a lot of luring going on. But then again, how else are they supposed to get their victims? Because they don't want to pull one from their own.
Well, they do when they have to.
But they don't want to. I mean, you know.
And that doesn't make them any better, though.
I'm not necessarily making them out to be moral. I'm just saying, like, they're holding on to some, like I said, some pagan, non-Christian beliefs, and I don't know if I'm willing to call that a cult.
But that's kind of like the original cult, right? We talked about how the original cult is any sort of like religious worship, whether it's Christian, non-Christian, whatever. So in a way, it's I feel like Wicker Man in some way, and I'm not a theologian, but I feel like Wicker Man in some ways kind of marries the original idea of like a cult of worship with like a more contemporary cult following a person, insider, outsider, strict separation. And yeah, I mean, sacrifice yourself. I mean, at one point, even though, yes, the point of the movie is that they're luring him there so they don't have to kill the girl, one of the mothers says something like, "You don't understand what sacrifice is." And so there's this idea that like when the crops are bad, if they feel like they need to kill a girl, they do. And that idea of like belonging to something that you think is bigger than yourself. And if the guy in charge says, "We need your daughter to make some crops come," you say, "A-okay." That just seems cult to me. I feel that just hits a whole new level of like giving your life over to somebody else because, yeah, I don't know. I lean toward cult.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I honestly don't have much to add there, but I just agree.
I don't know, guys. I mean, what they have is see, and maybe this is just it. What they have is a religion that is not common. I mean, people do crazy things in the name of religion. So I guess what I'm saying is, and yes, I know we're not theologians, and we're gonna get a lot of things wrong here, but I don't know, like, how should I put this? Like in the past, you know, sacrifice, whether or not it was animal or human, was was a thing that a lot of religions had in common. It was a common aspect. And so why is this any different? Just because most of society has moved away from that. Because
it sounds like you're justifying murder now.
I mean,
I want to hear how this goes.
Yeah. No, I'm not making. That's why I said I'm not making a moral judgment on them. I'm just trying to figure out if they are a cult or not. Because to me, they all seem like they really want to be there. Like I don't think, even though they kind of had the group think going on, I don't think Lord Summerisle is necessarily forcing anybody to be there.
Well, I would argue.
I think they're pretty happy.
Well, that's the thing is that with most of the cults that we've talked about, and even the ones that we've sort of glossed over or haven't had time to fully explore, I'd argue, like the people that are enthralled by the charismatic leader, like they're happy to be there. I've actually I know that our episodes on cults are over, but this has kind of sparked my interest in cults doing this series, so I've been listening to the Heaven's Gate podcast series that's out there. I can't remember who does it right now off the top of my head, but like all of them at the end, like the members from Heaven's Gate that did commit mass suicide, they all happily did it. Like they weren't forced. They weren't, like they videotaped themselves saying,
yeah,
hey, we're happy to do this. I mean, so I mean,
but they had been through the mind control, they had been through because they had been isolated.
Right.
They had been taken away from their family. They had been, brought into that us versus them mentality. They had, so in that state, yes, they were happy to do it, but that they had been manipulated.
Well, but isn't that similar of the Wicker Man? Like the people that were there, haven't they also been manipulated?
Yeah, they've grown up being told by all these Lord Summerisles that this is the right thing to do. Yeah. It reminded me of it's different, but I was also thinking, Matt, like the Wild Wild Country people, they all joined. And even after all this stuff went south, the people who were just joining for their own purposes were cool with it. Like it had done something good for them and they were happy about it when they were being interviewed. Not everybody had a bad taste in their mouth about it. So yeah, I mean, if you've grown up on this island, isolated, and the guy in the castle tells you that this is your religion, this is what you do, and this is how the kids are born into it, and they do it too. I mean, that is kind of a form of brainwashing at that point.
I guess I had just always seen this movie as a pagan versus Christian.
Oh, it's definitely that, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And less of a cult, because really, and maybe I'm just getting really nitpicky here on the definition of a cult, but if you're going to say that, well, they've been, taught this since they were young, and yes, I'm not condoning the murder, and yes, people are being harmed through this sacrifice. But couldn't that be said of mainstream religions too? That people are taught that from the time they're very little, and that, maybe human sacrifice isn't happening, but people are being harmed in some ways. Not all of them, but what's the difference?
And that is the moment where Lisa became an atheist.
No, I have my personal thoughts, but really, when you look at like the broad strokes of religion, I don't know. I don't want to call this a cult movie.
I would say, and
you feel very strongly about this.
I feel strongly about Wicker Man, okay?
Well, I think it's possible that it can be both. I mean, it doesn't have. Yeah. We don't have to stick with one single interpretation of the movie. I mean, a film, like a book, can be a text, right? And we can have multiple interpretations. I would say that, like, your reading of it is equally valid as this pagan versus Christian sort of allegory. That's not the right word, but maybe it is. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm not saying we're right and you're wrong, and I'm not saying you're right and we're wrong. I think both can coexist, because there's a lot of, I think, overlap and even slippage between this like pagan idea and cults. Even like you said, if you start getting real loose with the definition, all religion are cults, and we're all brainwashed. But I think most of the world's not going to necessarily agree with that interpretation. But if you do get too logical and try to like parse it down and just look at the definition, okay, yeah, technically I think almost all religions would fit that definition if you get too broad with it. So I'm not saying all religions are cults.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, I can see what you're saying. I still vehemently reject it, but
that is like the apology I get from the teenagers in my house. Like, I can admit that you were right, but I'm not wrong either. Just accompany it with a sneer and a stomped foot.
Believe me, if we were doing video, you would see it. No, okay. I will agree. Fine. It can be a cult movie and a folk. Because to me, folk horror is about the like ancient myths and kind of mythology and that type of world bubbling up into the modern world. And that's why I've always just kind of seen this as, you know, kind of this pagan Christian, I don't know, allegory. That's not quite the right word for it, but you know, whatever. And to me, I don't know, cult. But I don't know. Whatever. Okay, fine. I
see what you're saying. I do think it's folk horror. I think you're right. But for me, it's like the fact that there is a person in charge that's been kind of, I don't know, this is the wrong word, but like programming them from even their schools teach this. And then it's such a small, isolated group that makes me feel like it's a cult. But I agree with you that it is folk horror, whether it's a cult doing it or a pagan religious group.
Yeah. I was just trying to emulate the teenageriness with that.
Well, okay, so I have a question, and I know that this wasn't one that we had necessarily discussed, and we don't have to like follow this rabbit hole too deep. Where would you stand on Cabin in the Woods? Is that a cult, or is that just more pagan, like sacrifice worship?
Ooh, I don't know.
Yeah, it just came to me. 'Cause we don't have the charismatic leader sort of thing, and they are doing the sacrifice to literally prevent an apocalypse, not figuratively. I don't know.
That is like a
But it's like a Lovecraftian kind of cult.
Yeah, I mean, but it works in the opposite way almost. I mean, if you want to call that a Lovecraftian cult, I mean, because that definitely fits with like cosmic horror. Except this time the cult's trying to prevent it. Maybe?
Yeah.
I don't know. See, that one kind of fits under evil corporation too.
Oh, for sure.
So
without doubt that fits under that idea, that trope, if you will.
But if there were going to be a like Lovecraftian cult, it probably would be or Lovecraftian anti-cult, maybe. I don't know. See, I don't know. The movie comparison, this is where it starts getting really weird, because the movie comparison I think of when we start talking about Wicker Man and is it a cult or not, especially when you start talking about these pagan ideas, is the movie Children of the Corn. You know, whether or not that kind of fits. But to me, that has such supernatural aspects to it, and I feel like when you bring in the supernatural, can it really be a cult? but we spend a whole episode talking about the endless, so that throws that out of the window. But I don't know. That's my sticking point with something like Cabin in the Woods and Children of the Corn. Both is that they have supernatural backgrounds, maybe, if that makes sense.
Well, or just that we actually get to see that the cults, what they're worshiping is real. You know, like if this were the movie of Heaven's Gate and it ended with them actually like riding behind the comet in their spaceship, we'd be like, holy moly, they were right. And just like that kind of big and spoiler alert if you haven't seen Cabin in the Woods, just like the big reveal at the end of that movie where like, oh, they were right. They weren't just like crazy and doing this. They actually were right.
See, Matt, I really like that idea, because then that challenges the entire, when we did not discuss this when we were trying to define the word cult, but there seems to be an assumption when people use the word cult, and I'm using this very broadly, but that they are following something false, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, if it's proven, and it can be in these movies, you know, that something is true, then maybe it's not a cult, because it doesn't seem so outlandish anymore. And that was certainly kind of the twist in Cabin in the Woods, because you realize that it is quite literally the end of the world, that there's something out there about to devour everything. If it's, you know, need isn't met. And the same thing with Children of the Corn is, you know, that there really is something that walks in the corn that is, you know, causing all of this. And then you start to think, well, you know, it's not as insane as we thought it was. Because that's the problem, is when we talked a lot about it with the us versus them mentality, but when you look at something from the outside and you see people doing something crazy and you're thinking, why are they doing that? Well, on the inside, it doesn't seem that way. And you can say it's because, well, they've been manipulated, or they've been brainwashed, or, you know, they've been so isolated that they don't know anymore, you know, up from down or north from south. And, you know, maybe that's our problem. Like, maybe if we could prove in the lottery, for instance, that the town Shirley Jackson was writing about, like the moment they stop the lottery, something bad happens, and we can see, well, okay, they're doing something noble. And maybe that's the problem with something like Wicker Man, is that we are never able to see past the ending of that movie. Not in the same way we are with Children of the Corn or the Cabin in the Woods.
So the cult of Cthulhu doesn't really exist, because in the fiction, Cthulhu is real?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I don't know.
Or just that, I mean, maybe we should discard the idea that for it to be a cult, they have to be following something false. You know, I think...
Right.
I think a lot of people use the phrase cult, and they may not be doing it intentionally, but it has a pejorative to it. You know, it's definitely got this negative connotation of, oh, look at them, they're in that brainwashed cult. You know, like we always think of it as a negative aspect, or a negative connotation to the word. And that's probably also a big product of the 70s and 80s and the satanic panic and the deprogramming and all of that. But yeah, like maybe that would be kind of the best place to end our series on cults in general, is this idea that cults aren't necessarily negative, right? Like, I think we've all kind of, because I hadn't thought of it consciously like that until you pointed it out, but it's true. Like, it's there's a negative connotation to it that maybe it shouldn't be so stigmatized. Maybe that's what I'm trying to say. I'm not saying join a cult, listeners. I'm not saying go go don't go follow whatever just because, but Yeah, I mean, why the stigma? If it's something, I don't know.
Well, then no. I think that's so. I will tell you, Matt, that the more we've done this series on cults, the less comfortable I've been calling something a cult. For that very reason, because it does seem to be a pejorative, and that doesn't mean that some groups are not very harmful to people, and that, I mean, you talk about something like Heaven's Gate, and I listened to that podcast series, and it was heartbreaking and it was touching, and you really got to see the humanity of the people. And clearly they were involved in something that did end up being quite damaging to them. And that is, I think we need to rethink the way we approach these groups. And maybe just fringe groups would be just a better term, or fringe religions, because sometimes they're going to be, like we said, harmful, and that's when people need to be aware and step in. I mean, certainly if we're going to call Wicker Man a fringe religion, that is harmful to somebody, or the lottery, a fringe community. But I think we need to be careful how we throw around that term, because it might not always be harmful. It might just be different, and it might just be not as popular. Because when you were talking about like satanic panic, I immediately thought of, and we probably don't even have time to go into this, but I rejected right off the bat people calling, films like Rosemary's Baby a cult, which I guess is about a group of devil worshippers, at its heart. And I thought, but that's not a cult. They just worship the devil,
Right.
It's just a satanic cult, not a cult.
It's just, the satanic church. I don't know. But I was like, that's not that doesn't fit my definition of a cult. And maybe because it did fall into that supernatural, Cthulhu cult, or Children of the Corn, or the Cabin in the Woods even. Yeah, so I don't know. This is really, really making me rethink just basic vocabulary in a way that I don't think I've ever had anything do that quite in the way I've been rethinking cults as we've been talking about it.
Well, and I think you made a great point, and I do want to return back to that idea that, yes, maybe we're coming to realize that cult shouldn't necessarily be used as a pejorative, but there are ones that can be damaging, but not all cults are damaging. I just want to kind of reiterate that like, yes, Jonestown or Heaven's Gate or the Branch Davidians, those were all things that were certainly not healthy and had their tragic endings. But not all cults necessarily end that way. And yeah, I just wanted to underscore that again, because I think it is important, even if it's making me uncomfortable to say it, because like just the idea of cults, I keep thinking of it and my mind keeps going back to that negative connotation. So yeah, I'm having to rethink the vocabulary too here.
Yeah, this series had the same effect on me. And I think I mentioned that when we talked about the documentaries about cults, where, at the beginning of Wild Country, the people in the town are just kind of like scared of the group coming in because they're different. And when I was watching it, I was like, man, this kind of turns the stuff we've been talking about on its head, right? Because like we talk about insider-outsider conflict within these groups that we were talking about, but it's also really easy for people on the outside to just dismiss groups of people as you're in a cult. What you're thinking about is weird, or what you're doing is strange. Not to, like both of you said, say that there aren't dangerous or damaging groups out there. It just, yeah, if we sling the word around indiscriminately, it becomes a way to say that something is different from us or weird, or that we don't understand it. And instead of being open maybe to those sorts of things, as long as the group isn't a damaging one, it just seems like there's a knee-jerk reaction to say, that's strange and something I don't get, therefore I will dismiss that with this type of language. And I hadn't really thought about it that way either, or like all the different ways we use the term in our lives without, as a shorthand, without truly maybe thinking about what we mean.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I guess that's probably just an excellent place for us to wrap up, don't y'all think? So yeah, we said it's a bonus episode, but at the end of it all, I think this bonus has definitely like snapped some light bulbs off in our heads. That's for sure. So, um, just want to give a quick reminder too that we mentioned it in passing, but for those of you that are interested, we do have a Patreon account at patreon.com/nofearcast, where for $5 a month on our off weeks, you can get shorter mini episodes that usually will tie into our main theme and may have something that we haven't fully explored in the main episodes, or just stuff that we find interesting. I know we all really enjoy making them, by the way. So if you want more No Fear Cast, that's another way to get something every week instead of every other week. But no pressure, of course. But also, as probably if you're a podcast listener, please make sure to rate and review us on iTunes. It is, or wherever, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever it is that you're listening to this, because that really does help us. And one thing that we were talking about kind of in between recording episodes is I don't know how often we've plugged the fact that we have an email address. It is nofearcast@gmail.com. We do get occasional emails from listeners, and we really want more. Like, I think all three of us check it pretty regularly, and I know I can say for myself, when I see an email pop up on that account, I get a little excited and think, oh, someone's contacting us. So yeah, if you have an idea or just want to chat about something that we've talked about in an episode or whatever, please reach out to us. Email nofearcast@gmail.com. We're also on social media. We have a Facebook group and a Twitter account, which is also nofearcast. So yeah, just wanted to kind of reiterate those things. We really do like hearing from the listeners that reach out to us, and we're very responsive for these sorts of things. So I guess that's it for Cults. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time with our start of our next series.